The last words Loretta Henley spoke to me, with my hand resting on her forehead and her oxygen tank hissing in the corner of that small bedroom in Webster County, West Virginia, were words I have carried by myself for 22 years. She gripped my wrist with a strength I would not have believed possible in a woman of her age and her condition, and she pulled me down close enough that I could feel her breath against my ear, and she said, "My first husband was not a man, Pastor Glenn. He lived up in the woods above my granny's place. And 3 of my children, the oldest 3, they belong to him. They always did." She passed about 40 minutes after that, on a Tuesday evening in March of 2003, at 6:28 in the evening by the clock above her dresser. I drove home in the rain that night, with my hands shaking on the steering wheel of my truck, and I did what every country pastor learns to do with the secrets people give him in their last hour. I kept it. I am 83 years old now. My wife Helen passed away in the spring of 2018, and I retired from the pulpit at Mount Carmel Baptist Church in 2010 after 25 years of preaching to a congregation that never broke 100 souls on its best Sunday. I have buried more of my members than I have baptized, which is what happens when you serve a rural church in a county that is losing people every year to Charleston, to Morgantown, to Columbus, to anywhere that has work. I have heard a great many deathbed confessions across my years of ministry. Most are sad and ordinary. A man who fathered a child he never claimed. A woman who lifted money from her sister's purse in 1946 and never gave it back. A husband who was unfaithful one summer and carried that with him for 40 years. The people of these mountains are not given to easy talk, and what they release at the end is what they could not release while they still had time and breath. I have heard worse than what Loretta told me. I have also heard nothing as strange. My name is Pastor Glen Brooks. I was born in Pocahontas County in the spring of 1942, raised by a mother who played piano at the Methodist Church, and a father who worked his small farm and laid track for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad when the farm could not feed us. I went to Bible college in Tennessee on a scholarship, came home in '68 and served 3 different congregations across West Virginia before I was called to Mount Carmel in the fall of '85. By then I had been married to Helen for 16 years, and we had 2 daughters in junior high, and we settled into the parsonage on Route 20 next to the church, and we stayed. I have driven the same 15 miles of state route to do hospital visits in Sutton for almost 40 years. The roads up the hollers do not change much. The names on the mailboxes change, but the hollers themselves stay where they are. Loretta Henley was already in her 60s when I came to Mount Carmel. She had been a member of that church since before I arrived, since before the previous pastor arrived, since back when her husband Floyd was still living, and the 2 of them would sit together in the 3rd pew on the left, him in a brown suit jacket no matter the weather, her in a blue dress with her gray hair pinned up in the old style. Floyd worked at the lumber yard in Diana until his heart gave out in '95. He was a quiet man, a kind man, what people around here call a steady one. Loretta was quieter still. She had a presence I noticed from my first Sunday at Mount Carmel. Some people sit in a church and you can feel them paying attention. Loretta paid attention with her whole body. She did not nod. She did not say amen. She did not move much at all during a sermon. But you could feel her listening, and when you stood at the door afterward to shake hands, she would press your palm with both of her hands and look you in the eye and say, "Thank you, Pastor," in a voice that made you understand she meant it. She was not a fancy woman. She had worked at the school cafeteria in Webster Springs for 30-some years. She made the best apple butter in the county and brought a quart to the parsonage every fall. I knew she had 5 children. I had buried 2 of them by the time of her own passing. Her son Wesley had died in 1978, age 20, in a hunting accident according to what was written on his death certificate, though there had been some talk at the time that nobody was ever certain what really happened to him up in those woods. Her daughter Vada had passed in 1981, age 21, of what the doctor at Sutton General called heart failure, though Vada was a strong young woman with no history of cardiac trouble and the autopsy had been inconclusive. Her other son Lonnie was simply gone. He had walked out of the family home one morning in the summer of 1980, age 17, and had never come back. The state police had treated it as a runaway case. Loretta had told the trooper who came to her door that Lonnie had gone where he needed to go and she did not want any search. The trooper had closed the file within the month. I read these old records years later, after Loretta had died and after I had begun to understand what she had told me. Her two younger children, Bonnie and Carl, were Floyd's. That is how the family always referred to them, even to themselves. Bonnie's, Carl's, Floyd's. The other three, Wesley and Vada and Lonnie, were just the older three. I had assumed for the entire time I knew Loretta that she had been married once before Floyd and that the older three had come from that prior marriage. Bonnie still lives in Buchanan. Carl moved to Ohio in the 90s. Neither one of them knows what their mother told me on that Tuesday evening. I am writing this account in part because I believe one day they may want to know, and I will not be here to tell them. The cancer that took Loretta was in her pancreas and her liver, and it moved quickly the way it usually does. She was diagnosed in October of 2002. By Christmas, she could not climb the porch steps without help. By February, she was in a hospital bed in her own bedroom, and her daughter Bonnie was staying with her around the clock. I had been visiting 2 or 3 times a week through the winter, sitting with her, reading from the Psalms, sometimes just holding her hand while she dozed. She had asked me twice during those visits whether I believed in things that were not in the Bible. I had given her the answer a country pastor learns to give to such a question, which is that the Bible is a wide book and the Lord made more than what is named between its covers. She had nodded both times and let the subject drop. On that Tuesday afternoon, Bonnie called the parsonage and said Loretta was asking for me. I drove over right after my supper. The Henley place sat up the hollow off Birch River, about 4 miles past the last paved road, in a cleared bottom with the mountains rising steep on 3 sides. Floyd had built that house himself in 1966, the first year of their marriage, on a piece of property that had belonged to Loretta's people for generations. Her grandmother's old cabin was still standing about 300 yards up the slope behind the new house, falling in on itself but visible through the bare trees that time of year. I had passed it dozens of times on the way up to visit. I had never thought much about it. I came into the bedroom and Bonnie went out to the kitchen to give us privacy. Loretta was very weak. Her skin had gone the color of old paper and her hands lay on top of the quilt like things that did not belong to her anymore. But her eyes were clear. That was the strange part. Her eyes were as clear as a young woman's, and they fixed on me as I sat down in the wooden chair beside the bed, and she said, "Pastor Glenn, I have to tell somebody before I go. I cannot take it with me. I have tried for 50 years, and I cannot do it." I told her I was there to listen. I asked her if she wanted me to pray with her first. She shook her head. She said, "Pray after, listen first." And then she gripped my wrist the way I described, and she said the words, "I have already told you," and I sat in that chair while a woman I had thought I knew, across 2 decades of ministry, told me a story that rearranged everything I had ever believed about the woods behind her house, and about the country I had been driving through for 40 years. What I am going to tell you now is what Loretta told me, in the order she told me, in the words I can still remember her using. I did not write any of it down that night. I did not write it down for years. I held it in my head because I felt it would dishonor her, to put it on paper while there were still people alive who might be hurt by it. Floyd was gone. Wesley and Vada were gone. Lonnie was gone in the way only Lonnie was gone. But Bonnie was still living and Carl was still living, and I was the pastor of a small community that did not need rumors about the dead. So I held it. After Helen passed in 18, when I was alone in the parsonage and could no longer trust my own memory, I wrote it all out in a notebook that I kept in my desk drawer. That notebook is the source of what follows. The notebook plus what I saw with my own eyes about a year after Loretta died, which I will get to in its proper place. Loretta was born in November of 1937. Her father was killed in a coal mine roof fall in Boone County in 1943 when she was 5 years old. Her mother died of tuberculosis at the Pinecrest Sanatorium in Beckley in 1946. Loretta went to live with her father's mother, whom she called Granny Maddox, in the old cabin up the hollow where the Henley house now stands. Granny Maddox was a widow in her 70s by then, born in 1873, who had spent her entire life in that hollow and who knew the woods on the slopes above her cabin the way most people know the rooms of their own house. She kept chickens and a small garden and a milk cow named Sarah, and she taught Loretta everything she knew about the plants and the seasons and the weather and the proper way to live in a place that was a long walk from the nearest neighbor. Loretta grew up there. She walked 4 miles down the hollow to the school bus stop and 4 miles back every day during the school year. She had no electricity in the cabin until 1953, when the rural electrification line finally reached that far up the hollow. She had no running water until she moved into Floyd's new house in '66. She finished 8th grade and stopped because Granny Maddox needed her at home and because there was nobody to drive her the 18 miles to the high school in Webster Springs anyway. By the time she was 19 in the spring of 1956, she was a full-grown young woman living alone with her 78-year-old grandmother in a one-room cabin at the head of a hollow that nobody in Webster County had any reason to visit. The trouble started, she said, in April of '56. She used the word trouble, but she said it with a smile I did not understand at the time. The dogwoods were just coming out, she said, which is how she always dated things in the spring. She had gone up the slope behind the cabin to gather ramps. Ramps grow in patches in the higher hardwood coves in our part of West Virginia, and that spring there was a particularly thick patch about a half-mile up the mountain from the cabin, in a stand of old hardwoods that nobody but Loretta and her grandmother had any reason to walk through. She had her basket and her digging stick, and she was working her way through the patch when she became aware that she was being watched. She did not see anything. She heard nothing. She had no rational reason to believe she was not alone. But she felt the prickle on the back of her neck that anyone who has spent time in the deep woods will recognize. That absolute certainty that you have an audience. She told me she stopped digging. She stood up slowly and looked around. She saw nothing out of the ordinary. She heard nothing. The forest was quiet. Even the birds, she said, had gone still, and that was when she really started to be afraid, because the birds going quiet in the spring woods is never a good sign. She left the ramps. She walked back to the cabin without running, because Granny Maddox had taught her that running in the woods was how you got bears to chase you. She told her grandmother what had happened. Granny Maddox listened with the calm she brought to everything, and when Loretta was finished, the old woman set down her cup of sassafras tea and said, "Honey, there's been something up that mountain since long before I came to live in this hollow as a young bride. I never seen it myself, but my mother-in-law saw it once, and her father saw it twice. It doesn't bother people who don't bother it. You leave the ramps for this year. There's plenty of other patches." Loretta said she sat at the kitchen table that evening and tried to get her grandmother to say more, but the old woman would not. She said only that there were old things in these mountains that the new people did not know about and did not need to know about, and that the proper response was respect, not curiosity. Loretta went to bed that night and lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest, which she had been listening to her whole life and had never been afraid of before. She did not hear anything unusual, but the awareness of having been watched did not leave her over the days that followed. The second time was about 3 weeks later. She had been picking violets along the creek that ran down past the cabin, and she had walked maybe 200 yards upstream of the cabin into a stretch where the creek cut through a small flat surrounded by old hemlock. She heard a sound from the slope above her, the snap of a branch under a great weight, a sound like a tree falling in a windstorm, but heavier and slower. She looked up and saw nothing. The leaves on the hardwoods above the hemlocks were just coming in, and the view up the slope was partly screened by the new growth, but she could see enough to know that there was a shape standing on the slope, maybe 70 yards above her, behind the trunk of a big tulip poplar. The shape was upright. It was taller than a man. The width of its shoulders against the trunk of that poplar told her that whatever was up there was wider across the chest than any person she had ever seen. She froze. She did not run. She did not even breathe for a long moment. The shape did not move. It stood there with most of its body hidden by the poplar trunk, just enough of it visible past the edge of the bark for her to know it was there. She could not see a face. She could see what looked like the curve of a shoulder, and below that, the line of an arm hanging at its side. She told me she thought, "That's a person," and a half a second later she thought, "No, that's not a person, that's something else." She backed up. She backed up slowly, keeping her eyes on the shape until she had put about 50 yards between her and the poplar tree. Then she turned and walked, not ran, back down to the cabin. She did not tell her grandmother that time. She had begun to understand, she said, that what was happening in the woods around their cabin was not something she wanted to involve her grandmother in. Granny Maddox was old. She had heart trouble. Loretta loved her more than anything in the world, and was not going to bring fear into the old woman's last years. So Loretta started watching the woods on her own. She left things out. At first, she did this almost without thinking about it, the way a child leaves out a saucer of milk for a stray cat, a handful of dried corn on a flat rock at the edge of the woods, up the slope from the cabin, a few pieces of cornbread on the same rock the next week. After about a month, she started leaving small items on a stump farther up the mountain on her walks to gather kindling, a piece of fatback, a whole apple, once a piece of penny candy she had saved from her last trip to the store down at the crossroads. The items were taken every time. The first few times she did not know if it was the shape from the slope or a raccoon or a possum or some other ordinary forest creature. But over the course of that summer she began to notice that the items were not just taken. They were taken cleanly. A raccoon will leave a mess. A possum will leave tracks and bits. Whatever was taking what she left behind took it whole, took it neat, and left no sign of its passage. And about halfway through July, she started finding things on the stump in return. The first return she found was a piece of a honeycomb, no bigger than her palm, fresh and dripping, set neatly in the center of the stump, where she had left an apple 2 days before. She stood looking at that honeycomb for a long time. She told me she felt her hands go cold. There were no wild beehives that she knew of within miles of the cabin. The nearest one she could think of was a hollow tree down at the bottom of the hollow that some neighbor's boy had pointed out to her once. Whatever had left this honeycomb had gone down to that hollow tree or to one even farther away, and brought a piece of it back up to the stump and set it down where she would find it. This was, she said, the moment she understood that the thing in the woods was not just an animal. An animal does not understand trade. An animal does not understand reciprocity. An animal does not walk a mile and a half through the forest to bring you a gift because you brought it one first. Whatever was on the other end of these exchanges was thinking. It was paying attention. It was telling her, in the only way it knew how, that it had noticed her, that it considered her, and that it was willing to acknowledge what she was doing. She took the honeycomb home and ate it that evening with her grandmother. Granny Maddox asked where she had found honey this early in the year, and Loretta said a neighbor had brought it by while Granny had been napping. The lie came out easier than she expected. She felt sorry about it, but she also understood by then that what was happening between her and the woods was hers, and that until she knew what it was, she would protect it from anyone who might not understand. The exchanges continued through that summer and into the fall. Acorns left for her in a small, careful pile when she left a piece of cornbread. A bundle of dried herbs she did not recognize tied with a piece of grass in return for a strip of bacon. Once a small flat stone with a hole worn through the middle of it from creek water set on top of an ear of dried corn she had left the day before. She kept that stone. It is still on the dresser in her bedroom, or it was when I last saw it. She still had not seen the shape clearly. Twice more across that summer she had caught glimpses of it on the slopes above the cabin, at distances of 100 yards or more, always partly screened by trees. Once she had heard a sound at night, a low, sustained call that came from somewhere far up the mountain that she had never heard from any animal she knew. The call had been answered, she said, by another call from the opposite slope. The two had gone back and forth for perhaps 10 minutes, then stopped. She had lain in her bed, listening with her heart hammering and her hands gripping the edges of her quilt, and she had understood there was more than one of them. By the time winter came that year, the snow shut down the back of the cabin, and Loretta did not go up the mountain again until the following spring. She thought about the shape and the stump and the exchanges all through that winter. She did not tell anyone. There was nobody to tell. Granny Maddox was failing through the cold months, and Loretta was busy keeping the fires going and the meals coming. By the end of February, Granny Maddox had passed in her sleep peacefully at the age of 79. Loretta buried her in the family plot down at the foot of the hollow, next to her grandfather and her own parents, and the older Maddox graves that went back to before the Civil War. She stood at the graveside in a borrowed black coat and a black wool hat that had belonged to her grandmother, and after the few neighbors who had come up for the burial had left, she stayed by the fresh dirt for almost an hour, and she told me she made a decision then that she had been working toward all winter without knowing it. She was 19 years old. She had no living family that she knew of. The cabin was hers now and the small piece of land that surrounded it. But there was no money and no real way for a single young woman to make a living up at the head of that hollow. The mill at Diana would have taken her, but it was 12 miles away and she had no car. There was a boarding house in Webster Springs that took in young women for live-in domestic work, but she had heard things about that boarding house and did not want any part of it. She had been thinking all through the winter about going down to Charleston and trying to find a job there, the way some of the girls she had gone to school with had done. But standing at her grandmother's grave that February afternoon, she thought about the shape on the slope. She thought about the honeycomb. She thought about the bundle of herbs and the stone with the hole, and the calls in the night. And she thought about the fact that her grandmother had said the shape did not bother people who did not bother it. And she thought about her own life, alone in that cabin with no family and no prospects. And she thought, what would happen if I went up there? What would happen if I went up the mountain and sat on the stump and waited for him? She used the word him. Even that first time she said it to me, sitting beside her bed in March of 2003. She used the word him. Not it, not the creature, not the thing. Him. I noticed it at the time. I understand now what I did not understand then. Spring came that year, 1957, with a mildness unusual for our part of the state. The dogwoods bloomed early. Loretta had spent the last weeks of winter alone in the cabin, and by the time the trees began to leaf out, she had thought herself into a place where what she was about to do seemed less crazy to her than it would have to anybody else. On a Wednesday afternoon in late April, she walked up the mountain to the stump. She brought a basket with a fresh loaf of bread she had baked that morning, 2 strips of bacon, and 3 apples from the root cellar. She set them on the stump. Then she sat down on a flat rock about 10 feet from the stump, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. She waited for 3 hours. The sun moved across the sky. The shadows of the hardwoods shifted across the forest floor. A pair of red squirrels ran up and down the trunk of a hickory above her, fussing at each other. She did not move. She had brought a tin canteen of water, and she sipped from it twice. She had brought no book, no needlework, no distraction. She just sat and she waited. He came toward sundown. She did not hear him come. One moment the woods were empty. The next moment he was standing at the edge of a thick stand of mountain laurel, about 30 yards from the stump, watching her. He had stepped out from behind the laurel and stopped, and he stood there with his arms at his sides and his head tilted slightly forward. He was tall. He was taller than she had thought when she had seen the shape on the slope a year before. She estimated him at 8 feet, though she said she was not sure how to measure something like him with her eyes. He was covered in hair, dark, with some gray streaks through the shoulders that suggested he was not young. His face was the part she had not been ready for. It was not the face of an animal. It was not a face she had a category for. The brow was heavy, and the jaw was broad, and the nose was wide and flat, but the eyes that looked at her from beneath that brow were not animal eyes. They were thinking eyes. They were the eyes of someone who had been waiting for her to come up the mountain for a long time, and who was now seeing her up close for the first time, and who was taking the measure of her in the same careful way she was trying to take the measure of him. She did not move. She kept her hands folded in her lap. She kept her face calm. Her heart was going so hard she could hear it in her own ears, but she did not let it show. She told me she remembered thinking, "Granny said they do not bother people who do not bother them, and I have come up here on purpose to make peace, and if he wanted to harm me, he could have done it 100 times by now, and he is not. And I am not going to be the one to break the agreement we have built across the summer and the fall." He stood there for what she thought was about 5 minutes. Then he stepped forward very slowly until he was about 15 feet from her, and he sat down. He sat down on the forest floor with his legs crossed, the way a child sits, but with his hands resting on his knees, the way a man would. He sat there, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and the sun went lower, and the light in the woods turned that deep gold color it gets just before evening, in April in the high mountains, and neither of them moved. After a while he reached behind him, and he picked up something from the ground, and he set it on a flat place in front of him. She could not see what it was at first. Then he gestured with his hand, a slow, careful gesture, and she stood up and walked toward him, and she looked at what he had set down. It was a turtle shell, small, polished from age and handling, hollowed and clean. Inside the shell were 3 river pearls. They were the kind that you sometimes find in the freshwater mussels in the bigger streams down in the valley. Dull and small, but real pearls all the same. She had never seen one before. She had heard of them. She understood, looking at that turtle shell with the 3 pearls inside it, that he had been gathering these for a long time, that he had walked down to a stream big enough to hold mussels, broken open mussels, found pearls, brought them back up the mountain, kept them in this shell, and now was offering them to her in a way that meant something she did not yet have the language to understand. She stood looking at the shell for a long time. Then she did the only thing she could think to do. She reached into the pocket of her dress and took out a small thing she had carried up the mountain that day without thinking she would have a use for it. It was a thin gold ring that had belonged to her mother. It was the only piece of her mother she still had. She set it down beside the turtle shell. He looked at the ring. He looked at her face. He picked up the ring with fingers that were thick as her thumb. But he picked it up with a delicacy that astonished her. He held it up to the last of the light, and he turned it, and he made a sound. A low, sustained sound that came from his chest, that vibrated in the air around them. That was the first thing she had ever heard from him directly, and that she would later learn was an expression of recognition, of acknowledgement, of something that was almost reverence. He set the ring down. He pushed the turtle shell with the 3 pearls toward her. He stood up, and he stepped back, and he walked into the laurel and was gone. She picked up the turtle shell. She left the ring where he had set it down. She walked back down the mountain in the gathering dark, with no flashlight, with the shell pressed against her chest, and she got to the cabin and she lit the kerosene lamp, and she set the shell on the kitchen table, and she sat down across from it, and she did not move for a long time. She told me, 50 years later, in that bedroom in Webster County, that the moment she sat down at that table was the moment she knew she was not going to stay in the cabin, that her life was going to be lived up on the mountain with the one who had brought her the pearls. She did not move out of the cabin all at once. The transition took her almost 3 months into the high summer of 1957. She went up the mountain every day. She would meet him at the stump or near the stump, and they would sit together. At first, they did nothing but sit. She would bring food, and he would bring something in return. A piece of beeswax, a bird feather she did not recognize, a small bundle of greens she would later learn were edible mountain plants she had not known were edible. Slowly, he began to lead her. He would stand up after they had sat for an hour, and he would turn and walk a little way up the slope, and he would look back at her, and she would understand he wanted her to come. She followed him. The first time, only 100 yards. They walked together to a small spring under a rock overhang, and he showed her with a hand gesture that the water there was good to drink, and she drank from it, and the water was cold and clean and tasted of stone. The second time, half a mile, he showed her a stand of black walnut trees she had not known existed back on that mountain. He cracked one of the walnuts in his hand just by pressing his fingers around it, and he gave her the meat, and they sat together and ate walnuts and watched a hawk circle in the open sky above the canopy. By the end of June, she was spending most of every day with him. She would walk up the mountain in the morning and not return to the cabin until dark. She slept poorly when she was at the cabin. She started leaving things at his place: a wool blanket, a tin cup, a small knife, a book of matches. She did not know why she was doing this. She did, but she did not want to admit it to herself yet. He never came down to her cabin. She understood, without anything being said, that the cabin was hers and the mountain was his, and the agreement between them required this separation to hold. The first time he touched her was in early July. They had been walking up a high ridge, and the path had narrowed to a thin trace along the edge of a steep drop, and her foot had slipped on a loose stone. She had nearly gone over the edge. His hand caught her arm. The hand was so big it wrapped completely around her upper arm above the elbow, and the heat of his palm was such a shock that she gasped. He held her steady until she had her footing, and then he let go, but the warmth of his hand on her skin stayed with her for the rest of the day. She told me that was the moment she understood what was happening between them. She also understood in that same moment that she had no intention of stopping it. She went up the mountain to live with him on a Sunday in mid-July. She had packed a small canvas bag with her grandmother's hairbrush and a change of clothes and the turtle shell with the 3 pearls inside it. She had walked the 4 miles down the hollow that morning to the little crossroads store and told the man who ran it that she was going to Charleston to look for work, and he should not expect to see her for some time. She had left the cabin unlocked. There was nothing in it worth stealing and nobody up that hollow to steal it. She walked up the mountain at noon, met him at the stump, and walked with him deep into the woods to a place she had never been to before, a small clearing on a north-facing slope where a hand-built shelter stood under a stand of old hemlock. The shelter was made of logs and bark. The floor inside was packed earth, swept clean, with a sleeping platform of woven branches and pelts along one wall. There was a stone-lined fire pit just outside the entrance, with the ash banked carefully against the wind. He had built it himself, she understood, over years of working alone in the deep timber. He had built it in part for the possibility of her. She lived with him in that shelter for the rest of the summer, and through the fall and into the winter. She did not see another human being for 6.5 years. She was up there for those 6.5 years, and what she did during that time, and what happened to her during that time, is what she spent the bulk of our conversation telling me about. I cannot put it all down here. Some of it she said only once, and I could not be sure I had it right when I tried to write it down years later. Some of it she made me promise I would never repeat. But I can tell you the shape of it, because the shape of it is what matters. She learned to live on the mountain. She learned to find food in places she had walked past her whole life without seeing. She learned which roots and tubers and barks were safe and which were not. She learned to set snares for rabbits and to clean small game and to dry strips of meat on racks in the sun. She learned to weave baskets from inner bark and to make cord from sinew and to shape simple tools from stone. He taught her these things with patience she said she had not known any living being possessed. He would demonstrate a thing 20 times if he had to, without ever showing frustration, just steady and willing to wait until she got it right. When she got it right, he would make that low, sustained sound she had heard the first night with the pearls. She started making the sound back to him. He laughed. The first time he laughed at her trying to imitate his sound, she sat down on the ground and cried, because she had not known until that moment that he could laugh, and the laugh was the most human thing she had ever heard from him. She learned his language, not all of it. She told me she did not think any person could learn all of it, because much of it was carried in sounds that the human voice was not built to produce. But she learned enough. She learned the calls for food and for water and for danger and for come here and for stay back and for I am cold and for I am tired and for I love you. She learned that he had a name in his own language that was 3 sounds long. She tried to teach him English. He picked up a few words. Bread, cup, apple. He said them with a voice so deep that the words sounded like they were coming from underground. But mostly they spoke his language, and what they could not say in his language, they said by sitting close together and watching the same things, and understanding that they were understanding the same things. She met others of his kind. There were not many. She estimated she met 7 over those 6.5 years, and she said she believed there were perhaps 15 or 20 more in the broader mountain range she never met. They came through their territory rarely, in pairs or alone, never in groups larger than 3. The encounters were quiet. The visitor would come to their clearing, sit with him for a time, exchange the deep sounds with him, look at her with curiosity and without aggression, accept whatever food was offered and move on. She came to understand that her presence with him was something the others knew about, and that by the time she had been with him for 2 years, there was a general acceptance among them that she belonged to him, and what happened between them was theirs. She gave birth to her first child in February of 1958, about 7 months after she had walked up the mountain to stay. The pregnancy had been quick, faster than a human pregnancy, and she had not understood at first what was happening to her body. He had understood. He had brought her certain plants to eat and had helped her build a softer bed inside the shelter and had begun spending more of his time close to her instead of out hunting and gathering. When she went into labor on a cold morning with snow on the ground outside the shelter, he stayed with her. He did not try to help. He did not try to deliver the baby. He sat beside her and put his hand on her back and made the deep, sustained sound. The sound she had come to understand meant, "I am here. I see you. I am with you." The baby came in the early afternoon, a boy, large for a newborn, with dark hair across his shoulders and his upper back, with eyes that opened almost immediately and looked at her with a focus that no human newborn should have been able to manage. She named him Wesley because her father's name had been Wesley, and she wanted her son to have one piece of her family carried forward with him. Her second child, Vada, came in June of 1960. Her third child, Lonnie, came in September of 1962. All three were born in that shelter on the mountain. All three were healthy. All three carried in their bodies the mix of their father and their mother, in proportions that varied from one to the next. Wesley was the largest and the heaviest, with the most pronounced features of his father, dense hair across his shoulders and his arms, broad, heavy hands that gripped her finger with a strength that astonished her even on the first day. Vada was smaller and lighter, with finer hair you almost could not see, with features that leaned more toward Loretta's side, except for the eyes, which were dark and watchful, and saw things across distances no human child of her age should have been able to see. Lonnie was somewhere in between. He had his father's calm and his mother's quickness. He learned to walk earlier than the other two. He was speaking words by his first birthday, in both his father's language and in English, and he could disappear into the woods around the shelter so quickly and so quietly that even his father was startled by it. She raised them up on that mountain. She nursed all three of them and weaned them onto the food his kind ate, which was mostly roots and nuts and dried meat. The children thrived. They were not children the way the children she had grown up around were children. They were watchful, calm, slow to cry, quick to understand. By the time Wesley was 4 years old, he could track a deer through the woods without making sound. By the time Vada was 3, she could tell from the smell of the wind whether a storm was coming. They played with their father in the long summer evenings, climbing on him, riding on his shoulders, wrestling with him, and he was as gentle with them as a grown man is gentle with a kitten. They loved him without any awareness that the way they loved him was unusual. They loved their mother the same way. The trouble came in 1963. Wesley was 5 years old, Vada was 3, Lonnie was almost a year, Loretta was 26. She had been up on the mountain for 6.5 years. She had been happy in a way she had not known was possible for a person to be happy. But she had begun to understand, slowly across the previous year, that her children were going to face a problem she and their father had not figured out how to solve. They were going to grow up. They were going to come into their adult bodies, which would be the bodies of their father's people, large and strong and covered in hair. And they were going to be, for the rest of their lives, neither one thing nor the other, not human enough to live among humans, not enough of their father's people to live wholly among them either. She had watched the few visitors who had come through their territory, and she had seen how those visitors looked at her children, with acceptance, yes, but also with a distance. The children were of him, but they were also of her, and the distance was real and it was not going to close. She did not know what to do. She talked to him about it. She did not have all the words she needed in his language. and he did not have all the words he needed in hers. But they had been together long enough by then to understand each other on the deep matters. He understood what she was saying. He sat for a long time with his head bowed after she had said it, and then he made a sound she had not heard from him before, a sound that was almost a moan, the sound of a man who knows something true and does not want it to be true. He understood that the children were not going to fit in either world. He understood that the only chance they had was to know both worlds well enough to choose which one they wanted when they were old enough to choose. She told him she had to take them down the mountain. She told him she had to take them down to the human world for a time, so that they could learn to read and to write and to understand the language and the customs of the people who would surround them if they ever wanted to live in that world. She said she was not leaving him. She said she would come back. She said the children would come back. She said this was not the end. She said the words over and over because saying them helped her believe them. He listened. He looked at his children who were sleeping in a row on the bed of pelts inside the shelter. He looked at her. He nodded. The nod was a human gesture she had taught him, one of the few she had ever been able to teach him, and he used it then to tell her that he accepted what she had said. They sat together that night by the fire outside the shelter, and they did not speak much, and he held her hand in both of his enormous hands, and at one point he made the deep, sustained sound of recognition, the sound he had made over the turtle shell with the 3 pearls 6.5 years before, and she understood that he was telling her that whatever happened, whatever came next, she was his, and he was hers, and nothing was going to change that. She walked down the mountain in October of '63 with all 3 children. Lonnie was strapped to her chest in a sling she had woven. Wesley and Vada walked beside her, holding her hands. They went down to the cabin where she had lived with her grandmother. The cabin was still there. Nobody had been inside it in the 6.5 years she had been gone. The roof had a few holes in it from fallen branches. Mice had gotten into the kitchen, but it was livable, and she had a small amount of money her grandmother had kept hidden in a tin under the floorboards, and she had her own determination, and she set about making a new life for herself and her children in the only place she had ever lived as a human person. She did not return to the mountain that fall. She told herself she would in the spring. The children needed shelter and food and warmth through the winter, and she needed to work out how she was going to support them. She walked down to the Crossroads store and told the man who ran it that she had been working for a family in Charleston as a domestic, and that the husband had passed and the family had broken up, and that she had taken in 3 children whose mother had died and whose father was unknown to her. The man at the store had looked at her for a long time, and at the children who were tall for their ages and unusual looking enough that he must have wondered, and finally he had nodded and said he was sorry for her trouble and was there anything he could do. She asked if he knew of any work. He said he would think on it. She got work cleaning houses for the few families in the area that could afford a cleaning woman. She worked at the school cafeteria part-time when the new school year started. She bought a used coal stove for the cabin and laid in supplies for the winter. She enrolled Wesley in the 1st grade. The school took some convincing because she had no birth certificate for him and no documentation of any kind. But she told them he had been born in Charleston and that the hospital records had been lost in a fire, and the school, which had bigger problems than the documentation of one country boy whose family was clearly hard up, took him on her sworn statement. She did the same for Vada when Vada was old enough. The children adjusted, the way children adjust to whatever life puts in front of them. Wesley was quiet at school, and the other children left him alone because he was big for his age and had a stillness about him that they did not understand. Vada was more outgoing but had a hard time with the noise and the crowding, and she would come home from school exhausted and cry for an hour, and then go out to the back of the cabin and sit alone on the porch and watch the mountain. Lonnie, when he was old enough, was the one who fit the best, because he had been youngest when they had come down and had less of his early years up on the mountain to compare anything to. Loretta met Floyd Henley in the spring of 1965. Floyd was 31 years old, 4 years older than she was, a widower whose first wife had died in childbirth 2 years before. He worked at the lumber yard in Diana. He was a quiet, kind man who did not ask questions about Loretta's past beyond what she was willing to volunteer. He had come up the hollow one Saturday morning to deliver a load of milled lumber she had ordered for the porch she was trying to rebuild. He had stayed and helped her put up the framing. He had come back the next Saturday and helped her finish it. By the end of the summer, they were keeping company. By the next spring, they were married, and Floyd had moved into the cabin with her and the children, and he had set about, with no fuss and no complaint, raising another man's 3 children as his own. She never told him. That was the part of her story that she had cried about, sitting in that bed in 2003. She had carried it for almost 40 years of marriage, and she had loved Floyd with everything she had, and she had never been able to bring herself to tell him the full truth about the children he was raising. She had told him only that the children's father had been a man she had known in the deep woods, that the man had passed before she came down off the mountain, that the children were good children and would not bring shame on his house. Floyd had taken her at her word. Floyd had been, she told me, the most decent man God ever made, and the only burden she carried in her marriage was what she had not told him. The new house was built in '66, the year Bonnie was born. Floyd built it with his own hands on the bottom land below the old cabin, and they moved into it that fall, and the old cabin was left to fall in slowly across the years that followed. Floyd and Loretta had 2 children together, Bonnie in '66 and Carl in '68, and those 2 grew up alongside the older 3 and were as devoted to their older siblings as any children have ever been to their brothers and sister. Wesley was patient with Bonnie. Vada brushed Carl's hair. Lonnie carried Bonnie on his shoulders through the woods. The 5 of them were a family, but the older 3 were not made for the human world. Loretta had known it from the beginning, and the years confirmed it. They tried. They went to school. They learned to read and write. Wesley took a job at the lumber yard alongside Floyd when he turned 16. Vada worked at the diner in town. Lonnie helped Floyd with the garden and the chickens, but each of them, as they grew, was pulled by something the younger 2 did not feel. They would slip away into the woods for hours and come back changed, calmer, restored. They were homesick for a place they barely remembered. Wesley was the first to act on it. In the summer of 1975, when he was 17, he went up the mountain alone for 3 days. He came back with a piece of carved bone hanging from a strip of leather around his neck. He showed it to Loretta. She knew what it was. She knew who had carved it. She had not seen it in 12 years. Wesley said his father was alive. He said his father had grown older but was still strong. He said his father knew him somehow, knew which one of the children he was by smell or by some other sense Wesley could not name. He said his father had wept when they had met, and the weeping of his father was a sound Wesley would carry with him for the rest of his life. Wesley went up the mountain again and again across the next 3 years. He stopped working at the lumber yard. Floyd, who I think understood more than Loretta gave him credit for, did not press the boy. Loretta did not press him either. She had known from the day she had carried him down the mountain on her back as a baby that this day would come. In 1978, in November, when Wesley was 20, he went up the mountain and did not come back. He had told Loretta the morning he left that he was going to stay this time. He had told her not to worry. He had told her his father needed him and that he was where he belonged and that he would come down to visit when he could. He had hugged her at the door of the house, and he had shaken Floyd's hand on the porch, and he had walked across the bottom and into the trees, and that was the last time Loretta saw her firstborn alive. 3 weeks later, a hunter from the next county over found Wesley's body in a draw about 6 miles up the mountain. He had been shot in the chest. The hunter, who had not known Wesley, reported it to the sheriff. The sheriff investigated and concluded that Wesley had been mistaken for a bear by another hunter who had not come forward. The case was closed. Wesley was buried in the family plot down at the bottom of the hollow, next to Granny Maddox. Loretta told me, lying in that bed in 2003, that what was in the casket at Wesley's funeral was not all of Wesley. She told me his father had come down the mountain in the night before the burial, and that something of Wesley had been taken back up the mountain where it belonged. She would not say more about it than that, and I did not press her. Vada went up the mountain in the summer of 1979. She came back. She went again in the fall and again in the winter, and by the spring of '80 she was spending more time up there than down at the house. She turned 21 in June of '81. In July of that year she came down the mountain very sick. She was running a high fever. Her heart was beating too fast. Loretta took her to the doctor in Sutton, who could find nothing specifically wrong, but who admitted her to the hospital for observation. She passed away 3 days later. The doctor wrote heart failure on the death certificate because he could think of nothing else to write. Loretta told me, in that bed 22 years later, that what had killed Vada was something else. Her father's people, she said, did not live well in the human world for long stretches. Their hearts were not made for it. Vada had tried to live in both worlds, half down here and half up there, and the divided life had broken her body. Lonnie was 18 when Vada died. He had grown up watching his older brother and sister, and he had understood, by the time he was 16, what was going to happen to him. He grieved for them both. He stayed close to the house through the rest of 1981 and into the early part of '82, because Loretta and Floyd were both shattered by the loss of 2 children inside of 3 years, and Lonnie did not want to be the one to leave them next. But he could not stay forever. In June of '82, when he was 19, he went up the mountain in the early morning and did not come back. He left a note on the kitchen table that said, "Mama, do not worry. I am where I have to be, and I love you, and I will see Daddy and tell him you said hello." He had used the word Daddy for the man up the mountain. Floyd had read the note and put it down on the table and looked at her for a long time and then said, in his quiet way, "Well, I always wondered, and that was the only time across 40 years of marriage that he ever came close to asking her the truth." She had not answered him. He had not pressed. He had folded the note and put it in his desk drawer, and they had not spoken of Lonnie's leaving again. She did not see Lonnie after that. She did not know if he was alive or dead. She believed he was alive because she had never had the feeling about him that she had had about Wesley and Vada, the deep, sinking certainty that comes to a mother when her child is gone from this world. She believed Lonnie was up there with his father. She believed Lonnie was the one her father's people had let through, the one who had been young enough when he came down off the mountain that he had held the language fully, and the body fully, and the spirit fully, and that he had gone back to the place he was made for, and that he was living there still. She lived with that belief for the rest of her life. Floyd died in '95. Bonnie and Carl grew up and made their own lives. Loretta worked at the school cafeteria until she retired in 2000. She went to church at Mount Carmel twice a Sunday. She kept the house clean and the small garden she had inherited from her grandmother. And on certain spring evenings, she told me, she would walk up the slope behind the house, past the old fallen cabin where she had been raised, and she would sit on a flat rock at the edge of the woods, and she would wait. Sometimes she would hear, far up the mountain, a single sustained call. She would call back, as best she could in her old voice. The call would come again. and she would sit on that rock until the dark came and then walk down to the empty house and feel for the first time all day that she was not alone, that there was still someone up there in the trees who knew her and remembered her, and that the love which had begun in 1957 over a turtle shell with 3 river pearls had not ended. That was what she told me. She finished at about 6 o'clock that evening. The light was almost gone from the windows. Bonnie was sitting in the kitchen with the door cracked open, not listening but waiting. Loretta looked at me with those clear, dark eyes, and she said, "Pastor Glenn, I am sorry to put this on you. I did not know who else to tell. Will you keep it? Will you keep my children safe?" I told her I would. I held her hand. I prayed with her for as long as she could stay with me, and then she slipped into the quiet that comes at the end. And at 6:28, she stopped breathing. I sat with her for a few more minutes. I told Bonnie. I called the funeral home in town. I drove home in the rain, and I did not sleep that night. I want to tell you one more thing, and then I am done. In the spring of 2004, about a year after Loretta passed, I drove up that hollow on a Sunday afternoon. The house was empty. Bonnie had sold it earlier that year, and the new owner had not yet moved in. I parked at the gate and walked up the bottom and past the empty house and up the slope behind it to where the old cabin had fallen in across the years. I do not know exactly why I went up there. I wanted to see the place where Loretta had grown up. I wanted to stand where her grandmother had stood. I think I wanted, in some way I could not have admitted to myself, to see if any of what she had told me had been true. I sat on a fallen log near the old cabin. The afternoon was warm for April and the air was very still. The trees were just leafing out. I sat there for maybe an hour. I was not waiting for anything specific. I was just being a man alone in the woods, the way I had been a man alone in the woods many times across my life. I had just stood up to go when I heard it. A sound far up the mountain above the old cabin. A single sustained low call that rolled down through the timber like a roll of distant thunder. It was not any animal I had ever heard in all my years in these mountains. I knew in the moment I heard it what it was. I knew because I had been told. I stood by that fallen log and I felt the hair on my arms rise, and I felt my own heart, the old reliable heart that has carried me into the pulpit 1,000 Sunday mornings, slow down and steady itself the way it does when I know I am in the presence of something I will need to remember. The call came again. It was closer this time, or so I thought, though it is hard to judge distance with a sound that deep. I waited. I did not move. After a few minutes, the call did not come a third time, and I understood that whatever had made it had moved off, up the mountain, away from me. I walked back down the slope to my truck. I drove home. I did not tell my wife. I did not tell anybody, but I knew from that afternoon that what Loretta had told me had been true. I knew her son Lonnie, or her children's father, or some other one of their kind, was up on that mountain still. I knew the woods above Birch River were not empty in the way the maps say they are empty. I knew that the country I had been driving through and preaching in for almost 20 years had things in it that I had never imagined, that had been there before any of us came, that would be there long after I was gone. I am 83 years old. I have kept this story for 22 years. I am not telling it now because I want anyone to go up that hollow looking for anything. The hollow is private property. The new owners have a right to their peace. The mountain itself is part of the Monongahela National Forest behind it, and people are free to walk those woods. But I will say this. If you walk those woods, walk them with respect. Do not bring a gun, except what you need for your own safety from the bears. Do not call out. Do not look for tracks. There are families up there. They have been up there a long time. They lost a son and a daughter to the world below, and they took in a son from the world below. and they grieved for the woman who walked down the mountain in 1963 and never came back to stay. If you go into those woods and you happen to hear a call from far up the slope, the only proper thing to do is to stop and to listen and to walk away, knowing you have been allowed something most people never get allowed. I have buried a great many people across my years of ministry. I have stood at a great many gravesides and said the words, I have come to understand that the line between what the world calls real and what the world calls impossible is a line that runs through every life I have ever known, and that the work of being a pastor, the real work, is to stand at that line with the people who are crossing it and to tell them they are not crossing it alone. Loretta Henley crossed her line on a Tuesday evening in March of 2003. She told me her story before she went. She left her 3 older children up on a mountain where they had always belonged, in a way she did not fully understand and that I do not fully understand. And she left her 2 younger children down here with their kin, where they have made good lives. I told her I would keep her children safe. I have done what I could. I have kept the secret as long as I needed to. I am telling it now because I am old, and because no one is left who would be hurt by it, and because I believe Loretta would want it known, in the end, that the love she had on that mountain was a true love, and that the children she bore in that shelter under the hemlocks were real children, and that the only word that fits what she described to me, the only word that fits what I heard from the slope above the fallen cabin that April afternoon, is family. The mountains hold what we entrust to them. They have held a great deal across the years. They will hold this too.